All right. So today I want to talk about the long context of the Catholic Church and its relationship to modernity. I also want to talk about the ways in which the Catholic Church positions itself both as in contrast to modernity, right, fighting against it, but also in many ways developing programs that seek to kind of find a third way between different strains of modern thought. On the one side, liberalism, right? Thinking about capitalism, liberalism, laissez-faire, right? Anything goes. And then on the other side, socialism, right? That the state should take care of all of its people totally, right? The vanishing oftentimes of private property, heavy rules by the state. And so the Catholic Church tries to find this third way between there, or at least segments of the Catholic Church do. And so the first strategy against modernity was in many ways defensive. This was a fight against secularization. And by secularization, we mean sort of peeling off things that used to be in the orbit of the church and making them part of the state's job, right? And so this can be in anything like things like marriage, right? The marriage is done by the state, not by the church, or baptism, right? Where baptism was such that you would be baptized and you would essentially have a census by that baptism, but now the state is taking control of those things. And so the Vatican, right, the Pope finds its first fight, especially with liberalism and modernity in Italy, because Italy, before the 1860s, hadn't become its own nation. But now Italy comes together and the Vatican is found without a home, right? It's no longer in charge of temporal physical territory. And so one of the popes, right, Pope uh, Pius the Ninth, who served as pope from 1846 to 1878, took a very defensive stance against Italy, right? Italy, you've taken away, right, my temporal power as the sort of vicar of Christ, the representative of Christ on earth. And so um, in this, we see a series of writings by Pius the Ninth. One of them is called Quanta Cura, and it's attached syllabus of errors in 1864. And in this, the idea that the Roman pontiff or the pope can and ought to reconcile himself and come to terms with progress, liberalism, and modern civilization was rejected. And so, with the loss of the papal states, because the pope was in charge of temporal power before this, now we can see a response come once again in the First Vatican Council, which declared infallibility of the pope. And the infallibility of the pope is not necessarily everything that pope says is infallible, but speaking in terms of doctrine ex cathedra or from the bishop's seat, that then it is infallible. And so Rome wanted to regain legitimacy. The Vatican wanted to regain legitimacy and often sought to do so through diplomacy and accommodation. And so the so-called Roman question will be part of this situation where the Pope is seeking to find or to regain the lost spiritual authority that came with the loss of temporal authority. But now the Pope wants to regain this and does so through modern means, through trying to sign treaties with other nations, right? That if you nation in Europe or in Latin America sign a treaty with the Pope directly, and that will protect the sort of the lands or the churches, the rights of the church in that country. And so we see this happening in Latin America. Latin American Catholics had been mobilizing in diverse ways to stem the tide of secularization in Latin America as well. In Mexico, is the most sort of uh, one of the best examples whereby Catholic militants opposed secularization. But we can see this organization in many other Catholic countries as well, right? Places like Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Mexico, Colombia. And the idea there is that these countries begin to separate church and state. Oftentimes in the United States, we take this for granted as though every other country did this at the same time the United States did. But in places, especially where the Catholic Church was the predominant Christian tradition, the idea that the church and the state should be separated seemed to be utterly opposed to Christian life and belief and doctrine. And so here we see Catholics, many Catholics fighting against the separation of church and state. And so, and with that, they're also fighting against, because in the separation of church and state, many nations are beginning to take over the power that the church once played there. And the fear then is that if the state secularizes all these things, if the state takes away all these things, then people's faith will be in jeopardy, right? They'll lose their connection to the church and be more committed or loyal to the state, right? To this sort of state that in many ways they see as, ungodly. So if there's this defensive strategy, there's also an offensive strategy. And this is in the development of so-called social Catholicism. The second strategy was offensive activism, social renewal, not just reactionary and defensive, but also trying to articulate an alternative Catholic vision for society, this sort of elusive third way between capitalism and socialism. And this offensive vision was first articulated by Leo XIII, who was Pope from 1878 to 1903. And he wrote his papal writing called an encyclical called Rerum Novarum in 1891. And in this, it's basically thinking about all of the problems that come through industrialization, right? The plight of the poor, those that are the victims of long work days, right? Unsanitary working conditions, right? This is the Pope sort of beginning to reach out and say, what is the Catholic Church's vision for this? And he writes this in Rerum Novarum. The following duties concern rich men and employers. Workers are not to be treated as slaves. Justice demands that the dignity of human personality be respected in them. Gainful occupations are not a mark of shame to man, but rather of respect, as they provide him with an honorable means of supporting life. It is shameful and inhuman, however, to use men as things for gain and to put no more value on them than what they are worth in muscle and energy. Right? So here's the Pope saying, hey, capitalism, you need to beware, because you can't just think about people in terms of their uh, muscle and energy value, right? They're human beings. They have souls. They are valuable. They're they're created in the image of God. And so the Catholic Church has a duty and a responsibility to also be concerned with the plight of labor, industrialization, and urbanization, and the sort of working man and working woman. And with this, we'll see the start of workers' unions, right, led by Catholics, right, that will not be seeking to like strike or these violent sort of strikes as some sort of socialist workers' unions do, but the idea of balancing the needs of labor and that of capital, right? And so it is this third way. It's not quite as radical as, right, the socialist or eventually the communist, but it's also pushing back against liberalism. And so this fight happens then at the grassroots, right? There's Catholic workers organizations that begin to develop, right? Catholic, a group called the Catholic Action, we'll see in just a second. Um, And all of this, both the defensive and offensive part of Catholic activism, was trying to build something, to regain something that was seen as lost. In the medieval era, there was this fusion of political and religious culture in Europe, which was called Christendom, and the broad Catholic culture that united the throne and the altar. So that's Christendom. Now, with the advent of the modern era, with the French Revolution, with nation states, right, the separation of church and state, there was seen as a loss of Christendom. And so, what Catholic activists are trying to do with this defensive strategy of fighting against secularization and this offensive strategy of fighting for a kind of social Catholicism, reaching out to the workers, Catholic activists are trying to produce a new kind of Christendom, a new Christendom or Neo-Christendom, a re-Christianized society where law, culture, and community would be based on Catholic morality and teaching. For some, that seemed very utopian, right? This sort of almost magical place. But for many, it was a here and now kind of thing. Not necessarily a Catholic state would be created, but a state influenced and infused with Catholic culture. And so, uh, nowhere did this sort of come or become more of a reality than through a program started by the Catholic Church in the early 20th century called Catholic Action. So the Neo-Christendom model was embodied in an organization called Catholic Action, and Catholic Action provided a strategy of steering between too close a relationship with the precarious position of conservative parties and authoritarian regimes in countries, and then a desire to promote social development in relationships with the popular base of the church, which appeared to be diminishing. And so the Roman model of Catholic Action, established by Pius XI, right, who ruled from 1922 to 1939 in Italy, was seen as a Catholic lobby, right? It's not a political party, but it's exerting its influence over society, with the explicit requirement not to engage in party politics, provided the framework for Latin American hierarchies in the 1930s and 1940s. The laity was to form corporative groups divided by age and gender, which would moralize the young and act as a training ground for Catholic activists. So that was all well and good. But the reality was that to build this group of Catholic action meant that it had to temper or to sort of calm down many activists throughout the world who were fighting for this neo-Christendom in their own countries. And again, the example of Mexico is really interesting because in Mexico, Mexico had a revolution from 1910 to 1920. And after the violent period of the revolution ended, in that violent period, there was between 1 to 2 million Mexican people that died through war, famine, disease, and another million or so that began to immigrate to the United States because of this revolution, fighting to get a dictator out of power, a man by the name of Porfirio Diaz. So all of this meant that Catholics were positioned in this post-revolutionary era in the 1920s, especially in a place where they felt that not only the revolution had thrown out the dictator, but also the revolutionaries were very anti-religious, some of them, and anti-clerical, meaning they didn't want the church to continue to meddle in politics. And so in the post-revolutionary era in Mexico, new laws began to be passed that severely curtailed the rights of Catholics. Like they couldn't worship outside of church buildings, priests couldn't wear priestly garb or clothes outside of church buildings. All Catholic elementary schools or all Catholic and religious education in elementary school was outlawed, right? You couldn't have religious education for young kids. As well as the fact that the state would be the one to register bishops, which that really freaked a lot of Catholics out because that meant that if the state could register the bishops, then that meant that maybe they would register somebody that wasn't really Catholic, right? That they would lose control of that. all of this meant that in the local areas in Mexico where people saw part of their village identity as closely aligned with Catholicism, and here's the government intruding, uh, oftentimes they revolutionaries could show up, and they would take the icons of saints and burn them, or forbid certain kinds of rituals or celebrations or worship. Catholics got so angry that they rose up in rebellion against the Mexican government. Around 50,000 Catholic rebels were actually in arms by 1929. So, for 3 years from 1926 to 1929, the Cristero Rebellion was fought by Catholics who rebelled against the Mexican government because of these anti clerical or anti church measures. As many as 90,000 or so people died, both on the side of the Cristeros and the government, as well as civilians. And it was a horribly traumatic situation. Some priests were actually shot. One in particular, probably the best well known, is a Jesuit priest by the name of Miguel Pro, who was thought to be conspiring against the Mexican president to assassinate him, and essentially he was captured. Right, these were sort of trumped up charges, and he, without trial, was taken out back and executed. And in the midst of that, in, at the very last moment, he put his arms out in the form of a cross and said, "Viva Cristo Rey, long live Christ the King." Right, and this war cry, "Viva Cristo Rey," right, meant that these rebels were called the Cristeros, right, those for Christ. And so all of this meant that by the 1920s and 1930s, there were violent reactions against uh, sort of state desire to curtail the power of the Catholic Church. And only 1940 and onward would spell a new set of issues for the Catholic Church, especially after World War II and the beginnings of the Cold War, which we'll talk about next time.